Thank you very much, Robbie. I've just got to fiddle about with this and get it right. Okay, good. Control. Great. Thank you, Robbie, and thank you, Sue Einhorn, and above all, thank you, Sylvia, for inviting me to do this. The problem, of course, is that when you're responding to such a full and such an interesting lecture, I really felt I only had the alternative of going off on a bit of a tangent, which is what I'm going to do. So I called my response, Who's Being Group Analytic? I'd like to start off with a story from a group. This was a group that ran for 24 years at the hospital where I worked, although, of course, I was the only person who was in it all the way through. Patients do sometimes get better, but group analysts just carry on. This is about halfway through. It's several years ago, and the group did give permission to write about them, but I have still changed the details. One patient in the group was a very clever, eloquent man with a severe, long-lasting manic depressive illness for which he took a mood stabilizer and antidepressants. He had had admissions in the past. When he was low, he could be dangerously suicidal, and when he was high, he could be angry and grating and omnipotent. If he came high to the group, they would know immediately and tell him forcefully what he was doing, and he would often calm down. He was clever and well-read, not well enough to work, but with many interests and a deep commitment to a range of unconventional religious beliefs. He was also the child of old-style communist parents, and he and his siblings felt always that their parents cared more about the international working class than they ever did their children. Similarly, in the group, he either idealized me at a distance or, more often, found me unkind and useless, the sort of therapist he thought who, like his parents, cared more about the group than about him. Now, one day, when he was quite well, he was talking about his intense suicidal thoughts. He explained that what had kept him alive on many occasions when he wanted to die was his firm belief in reincarnation. The group were very impressed with this and interested in his experience, although skeptical but respectful about reincarnation. They started to play among themselves with the idea of reincarnation. Did they believe it? What would it be like? This then led them to imagine how awful it would be to die and then to be reincarnated as a patient in a group. They enjoyed this thought for a while, and then they all agreed that what would be worst of all would be to die and then be reincarnated as a group analyst. Now, this was a very good group, a group I trusted to very much get on with it, but there was also a lot of illness and trouble, and the group often went through periods of deep, shared melancholy, as in the frequent talk of death, despair, and suicide. So what was going on here, and why did I start with this story? Well, there was obviously a lot happening in the group, but I only have time to talk about one small aspect. What I think this illustrates is that our groups are very often interested in and knowledgeable about, and if they aren't, they try very hard to imagine what's it like for us being a group analyst. We, of course, know that they're interested in us as transference objects, usually an incompetent parent, as the psychotherapist generally, and as extensive objects of curiosity. Our personal life, do we have children, what car do we drive, where do we live, all those ordinary things. But I do think that this example indicates that the group knows something or can collectively imagine something about what it's like to be the group analyst. So this is a slightly awkward slide into the topic of Sylvia's lecture, a complex and changing identity as group analysts. Now, over the years, people have often said to me at meetings, or if I've given a talk, things like, quote, "That was very group analytic," or, more often perhaps, "That's not very group analytic." Now, I think we actually say this a lot, or think it a lot, even if we don't say it out loud. And for me, and perhaps for many of you, it's become an internalized question, another thing to worry about. Am I still being group analytic? And if not, then who is being group analytic? In addition, I trained as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist some years after I trained as a group analyst. And the whole time that I was training, I could never mention group analysis in seminars or meetings. The individual psychotherapists either ignored it if I did, or judging by their facial expressions, suffered a sudden severe attack of severe indigestion. So I can also, at the same time, be asking myself another difficult question: am I being psychoanalytic? Now, many of us do other trainings, as Sylvia was saying, or fall under other influences, or bring to our training here another previous training or commitment. Where do these other allegiances stand in our minds in relation to group analysis? Are we still being group analytic? So these sorts of internalized questions, which are fundamentally about our group analytic identity, are important to bear in mind when we try to think deeply, as Sylvia has helped us to do this evening, about our identity. I think that Sylvia has laid out for us a clear and rich picture of how a professional identity such as ours evolves and changes over time under continuous pressure from and in interaction with societal and political changes. As group analysts, of course, we wouldn't have this any other way. We have to assume that over time, society throws up the kind of group psychotherapy that that particular society needs at that point in time, and the organizations necessary to sustain it, or the opposite, of course, which seems to be the case now. But the most important thing is that we are aware of this and work with it. If we don't see this and try to understand it for what it is, using our group analytic identity and knowledge to help us with this, then we cannot effectively dispute and resist the accompanying destructive processes. These processes which so many of us here have seen in the public services. To avoid or deny this aspect of social reality is to put us in danger of moving away from psychological work and into the area of theology and maybe martyrdom. So, what I understand from Sylvia's lecture is that our identity has to be flexible, self-reflexive, and resolute, and that we can use the knowledge and experience that enliven our identity to understand and work with the continuous societal and political changes that we're subject to. And I think that Sylvia maps this out well. Well, so far, so good. I want to look at something slightly different now. It has two aspects. First is the nature of the identity that the group, each group at any one moment in time, gives us. And second, related to this, the possibility that we might have a more complex, conflicted experience of our group analytic identity than we, on the face of it, think. Everyone who's conducted an analytic group will know how powerful the effect of the group is on the group analyst. That much is obvious. We also know that every time a new group member joins, the whole group changes in response, and the group as a whole remakes both itself and the new member. It seems to me obvious, therefore, that the group creates the group analyst that it needs as a group as a whole at any one moment in time. We've all had that feeling at times of wondering who we are for the group today. Why does everything feel so different? And why is it that whatever I do and say, the group are making me out to be a fool, a persecutor, a tyrant, a seducer, or, more rarely and suspiciously, an utterly brilliant psychotherapist, someone usually very different from my own perception of myself at that moment. And of course, we are helped to understand this to some degree by many different concepts. Transference, for example, projective identification, malignant mirroring. The process of unraveling this in the group can be extraordinarily helpful, particularly if we bear in mind this idea that each group creates the group analyst that it needs. Paradoxically, of course, this can only happen if the group analyst lets it happen. Here's an example. One morning in a long-running group, also in the hospital some years ago, but a different group, one group member, a fairly straightforward, anxious and depressed man, had by chance met me in a newsagent's on the way to the hospital. He seemed absolutely astounded by this. And at the start of the group, he immediately said how surprised he was to see me there. He assumed, he said, that I lived somewhere like Boreham Wood, which is a respectable middle-class commuter town north of London. And he could hardly believe that he'd seen me coming to the hospital from another direction. So something interesting has started straight away. Not only the delightful possibilities of the name of the town, but also I am suddenly not the man they thought I was all along. The group talked about this for a bit, and then immediately another man, a very difficult, rather paranoid, omnipotent man, started to talk. He had recently, a week or two earlier, told the group that he was the greatest painter in the history of the world. They were a bit surprised at this because, as far as they knew, he never did any artistic work at all, and they'd questioned him. Rather impatiently, he explained that he was the greatest painter in the world because he imagined these absolutely marvellous paintings and then never spoiled them by turning them into mere paint and canvas. Now, the group had been interested in this, and they were very tolerant. But on this particular morning of the group, they were irritated with him. He was talking about how angry he was with his ex-wife. She was very ordinary, he said, when they met. In fact, quote, rather common. And he had worked hard to mould her and improve her. She had not been at all grateful, he complained. And perhaps not surprisingly, she soon left him. Now, the group objected to this, but they were careful of him. And then one woman in the group said he was just like Dr. Dolittle. Now, this was the result of a very helpful, unintentional, unconscious scrambling up. They meant Professor Higgins, of course, from Pygmalion and My Fair Lady, who, for a bet, trains a very poor working-class girl called Hilda Doolittle to appear very upper-class and then falls in love with her. The group began to realise, as they talked about it, they weren't getting it quite right. And then someone mentioned Dr. Dolittle from the children's books by Hugh Lofting. And then another woman remembered one of the imaginary animals from the books, the Push-Me-Pull-You, which has two heads, one at each end. We then had a lively and complex conversation which helps us make all sense of this. I realised that the Push-Me-Pull-You was a type of relationship that I could get into with them if I wasn't careful. The pushing and pulling was to do with my frustration at their slowness. And a head at each end, of course, means too much thinking and not enough other bodily parts and functions. So I said to them that they were angry with me for not being helpful, for pushing and pulling them, for being too much in my head, in fact having two heads, and they must feel that I could do little for them. I said, in fact, I was Dr. Dolittle, and what's more, that they were sure that I would bore them, coming as they thought I did from Boreham Wood. Now, it's a great privilege to be let in on this kind of wonderfully creative group thinking, where the unconscious, individual and group is right there in the room. And when it's possible, if only for a moment, to see clearly how the group created me unconsciously together as the kind of group analyst that they needed that particular morning. This is group analysis influenced by Winnicott, of course, as in, quote, "Hello object, I destroyed you," from his paper, The Use of an Object. The group, individually and as a whole, continually destroy and recreate over time in a different form their damaged objects. In group analysis, by recreating in the group the historical, real and fantasied relationships between those objects and not just the objects. If it is the case then that an essential function of our job as group analysts is to make ourselves as open-heartedly as possible available to be endlessly recreated by the group, does this form an essential part of our identity? I think the simple answer is yes, probably, if only because it ensures that we stay as much as possible in the present moment in our groups and interactions, the only place where things can change. The second question that I want to raise is about the possibly complex nature of identity itself. I recently did some research about group analytic thinking by interviewing some senior group analysts. I recorded and transcribed the interviews and then did a formal thematic analysis of the transcripts. What I'm interested in is the working theories that we use moment by moment in the group. There's already been some work in this area in individual psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, and you may know Victoria Hamilton's book, The Analyst's Pre-Conscious, from several years ago. There are a number of ways of thinking about this. Using terms from memory research, one American researcher talks about the difference between declarative and procedural knowledge. Declarative knowledge is what we think we know, what we tell other people we do, what we teach our students, and what we write books about. Procedural knowledge is what we actually do, moment by moment, when we're doing it. This is what we know, but don't know we know, even while we're acting on it. For example, what distinguishes expert practice in every field, from sports to engineering, is the ability to improvise. Research has found, for example, that if you video psychotherapists who've written manuals, they never follow their own manual. Now, the philosopher Michael Polanyi calls this tacit knowledge. His famous quote is, "We can know more than we can tell." And his example is about riding a bike. We're able to ride very well, but we can't explain to another person how we do it. For the analytic philosopher Gilbert Ryle, it's the difference between knowing how and knowing that. His example, as a typical analytic philosopher, is a person who tells funny jokes but can't explain why they're funny. Now, what I found through the analysis of these interviews was that group analysts seem to employ, consciously and pre-consciously, explicitly and tacitly, groups of related concepts which fell into 6 clusters, for example, cohesion, trust, reflection, mirroring, and 2 nodes, the matrix and Fuchs. This forms a kind of busy internal mental group. Each of the 6 clusters of working theories interacts with at least one or more other clusters. But what distinguished what I called the nodes of working theories was that all of the 6 clusters seemed to interact continuously in their working thoughts in the course of the group with the nodes of both Fuchs and the matrix. This may be a long-winded way of stating the obvious, but that's true of most research. But what it suggests is that an important part of our identity, whether we are conscious of it or not, whether it's tacit or explicit, is a continuous internal debate in the group analyst, in the course of the group, both with folks, who may therefore function as a kind of internal object in the group analyst's mind, and with the central group analytic idea of the matrix. As Sylvia said in her lecture, group analytic method drives group analytic theory. This then leads to the creation of a dynamic matrix and the generation of meaning. And this must be the basis of our professional identity. I was very struck when I was thinking about Sylvia's lecture by a remark in a book by the American philosopher Owen Flanagan. He's talking about what might help to, quote, advance the projects of understanding better whether and how human flourishing is possible, if, that is, it is possible. Living well, finding meaning in a material world for finite beings is a really hard problem, the hardest problem of all. What could be a better everyday vehicle for this enormous project, the hardest problem, than a group analytic group? And it is what we all continue to try to do in the face of all the obstacles in our way, not least of them, of course, ourselves. If we are not, as group analysts, about understanding, finding meaning and human flourishing, then what are we about? I know that Sylvia has described this, and I just want to emphasize it further, that the center of our identity as group analysts, in spite of all the enormous and continuous changes around us, whether we are always conscious of it or not, is an identification with the project of increasing human flourishing by means of talking in small groups. When I first worked in the mental health field in 1973, it was as an unqualified social worker in East London. I was a bit overwhelmed at times, to say the least, by the tide of poverty, oppression and despair. By chance, I read a wonderful novel by the great Hungarian novelist George Conrad called The Caseworker. It deals, among other things, with the dangers of over-identification and vicarious trauma. What sticks in my mind is the ending, where the central character, the caseworker, lists all of the suffering people who might come to see him. At the end of the list, he says, quote, "One of us shall talk, and one shall listen, at least you will be together." Now, as Bob Dylan warns us in the course of The Times They Are Changing, quote, "You better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone," and, quote, "Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand." We have to work together and we have to talk about it. So, who's being group analytic? I agree completely with Sylvia, although I put it slightly differently. Our identity is founded in the potential of the small group to increase understanding, to find meaning, and to promote human flourishing. Many other things have flowed from this source, but essentially we're 7 or 8 people sitting in a quiet room. The chairs are in a circle, there may be a table in the middle and a box of tissues. There's silence, and then one of us shall speak and the other shall listen. At least we shall be together. Thank you.